Welcome to USD Conversations. My name is Noelle Norton. I am the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. This is our weekly speaker series featuring faculty, alumni, and friends who they share their insights around current events and timely sciences and USD Humanities Center and the Office of Alumni Relations. Following our popular spring semester series, we were urged to host 2 more summer events thanks to a really unexpected outpouring and prompting and support from our alumni. One example is there's a student, and I think she's here today, Megan Schuber from the class of 2019. She sent us an Instagram stating this, and USD, I wish I could sit in on one more lecture about what's happening right now. So Megan, we heard you, and we invited the faculty that you specifically asked to speak, and we let others know who expressed similar sentiments. So thank you for this idea, and we are delighted to bring you today's USD's conversation. So the topic is Black freedom struggle and the movement for Black lives with our guest speakers, Dr. Cory Gooding and Dr. Channon Miller. They will delve into the history of the Black freedom struggle and discuss the aims and goals for the movement for Black lives. So I'll tell you a bit about each of them. Dr. Cory Gooding, and he's from my own department, political science. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Racial and Ethnic Politics, and his research explores the impact of racial identity on political engagement. So currently, Dr. Gooding is developing a book manuscript that examines group-based identity, socio-political attitudes, and political engagement among Afro-Caribbeans in the United States. That's Dr. Professor in the Department of History. She is an interdisciplinary Americanist and historian that writes and teaches across various fields, including African American history and studies, women and gender studies, critical race and gender theory, and African diaspora studies. So Dr. Miller's current project explores African American, African-born, and Caribbean-born mothers and their reversal of Black borderalization. So I want to thank you both from the bottom of my heart and Megan's heart too, for everyone in our audience joining us today. I have heard it's the biggest audience that we've had for USD Conversations, and they've all been big, and this is even bigger. So so there's that. We will be taking your questions in the chat throughout this presentation, and we will save the last 20 minutes or so for a Q&A session with our 2 speakers. So at this point, Channon and Cory are going to start their presentation. I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we'll get to both your submitted and to the Q&A portion of this. So there we go. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Noelle. This is a great opportunity to share with the community and to think about these important ideas, particularly in this political moment. On May 25th, 2020, police officer Derek Chauvin pressed his knee into the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes. As Chauvin drove his body weight into the throat of Floyd, he extinguished the life, upended a family, and damaged a community. The murder produced a shock to the American conscience, placing the realities of anti-Blackness into view. As protests arose across the country and the world, every utterance of George Floyd's name not only carries with it the weight of a human life and those he touched, it also carries with it the echo of the names of others who were the victims of state-sanctioned violence. These names include Emmett Till,
Renisha McBride,
Abner Louima,
Marlene Pinnock,
Tamir Rice,
Oscar Grant,
Freddie Gray,
Sandra Bland,
Jordan Edwards,
Sean Bell,
Michael Brown,
Eric Garner,
Trayvon Martin,
after Trayvon Martin, we have Ahmaud Arbery,
Corinne Gaines,
Ayanna Stanley Jones,
Amadou Diallo,
John Crawford,
Tony McDade,
Eleanor Bumpers,
Breonna Taylor,
and George Floyd.
and as we read these names, we acknowledge that these names are only but a few of the many folks who have been deeply impacted, who have been affected by state-sanctioned violence. And the lives and the relationships and the communities that are affected are also represented in statistics that highlight a reality that is generations long. And it responds to, or it's a reflection of what a movement is seeking to address and attempting to challenge.
Recent studies on the proclivity of police brutality and anti-Black state-sanctioned violence have revealed, especially platforms such as Mapping Police Violence, have shown that Black people have been 28% of those killed by police since 2013, despite being only 13% of the population. Mapping Police Violence also reveals that as Black people are most likely to be killed by police than their counterparts, than their white counterparts, that this does not reflect a rise in crime rates. This chart displays that throughout the nation's cities, that as crime has declined, policing and violent policing has only increased. It is also important to acknowledge that the vast majority of these victims are unarmed. Importantly, there is no accountability when it comes to this state-sanctioned violence. In the cases that we've mentioned, the aforementioned cases, the court has not prosecuted officers responsible. 99% of killings by police from 2013 to 2019 have not resulted in officers being charged with a crime. So how do we get here? That is critical to this conversation as well. And when we talked about the potential ways to really categorize how we got here, we selected overall 3 categories or 3 themes, and that's the protection of white spaces, the presumption of Black guilt, and the undermining of Black political voices. One of the key ways in which we see the protection of white spaces and see this early on is through slave patrols. There is no way that we can understand the impact or the functioning of law enforcement in present day society if we don't look at the root, the foundation, what this institution was built for and what it was intended to do. And that is to police, regulate, and totally repress Black freedom. When we think back to the institution of slavery, the enslaved were not allowed to resist or retaliate against their slaveholders. They were not allowed to run away. They needed to carry passes or tickets in order to navigate spaces outside of their plantations. They were not able to gather in large groups. And these slave codes are publicly available online, and you can take a look at each of the bylaws and find that there were various regulations in place. But how did they maintain the bondage of the enslaved? Patrols, forces dedicated to inflicting punishment when the enslaved stepped out of line and inflicting brutalization. These institutions were put in place to ensure that the law was protected and to ensure that, again, Black freedom was impossible. So that is the foundation and that is the root. And when we move towards post-enslavement, the goal is to continue to protect white spaces and in particular white domination, but that's much harder to do post-Emancipation Proclamation and post the 13th Amendment. So the other goal is to find other means of control. So law enforcement are no longer responsible for slave patrols, as these folks, as Black folks, are now free, but they are responsible for enforcing Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal, and often doing so brutally. They are also partner to and proponents of and supporters of the mass lynchings of Black peoples, and ensuring that those responsible were not indicted or charged, but rather protected. They also participated in mob violence, the invasion of Black communities, such as in Memphis in 1866, Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the years to follow. So as Black folks strive to build their own independent and self-sufficient communities, these mobs were determined again to ensure that freedom was inaccessible, that although legally they were free, that their ability to move around and have mobility and actually challenge and contest white supremacy would be impossible. We also have, clearly moving into the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s, the protection of white spaces epitomized in the activities or resistance of folks like Rosa Parks, who was asked to get up and remove herself from a segregated bus because she sat in a white seat, and was also subject to police brutality, as with other Black women and men who were forcefully removed from seats and more if they invaded and sat in what was declared to be white spaces. So it's in this history that we really see what these police forces were intended to do and have been intended to do, what they were incorporated to do, and that's protect the law, and in particular, protect society from Black folk and from Black freedom.
Yeah, just to add on to that, in terms of the protection of white spaces, we can see elements of that continuing today, right? And so in the move to quote unquote revitalize neighborhoods, which is often a way of talking about increasing high income, primarily sort of white residents in certain communities, we also see with that comes a move with contemporary policing practices that can be understood as or discussed as stop and frisk policies, quality of life policies, the maintenance of order policies, and broken windows policing as the aggressive pursuit of more dedicated police resources to arresting, stopping, detaining primarily Black and brown bodies in neighborhoods across the country. We see evidence of this relationship where a community is seeking to do a revitalization effort or a gentrification effort, and the move of these new kinds of policies in New York, in Seattle, in Portland, and over again, it seems to be a consistent trend in terms of how we understand the use and the deployment of the police to protect white spaces. At the same time, we can also see the police as also engaging in acts that presume Black guilt. And here we find, at least in the contemporary period, evidence of this in the sort of common phrase or acronym DWB, right? Driving while Black. Here in San Diego, police stopped Black people at higher rates than white people in 85% of the police beats in the jurisdiction. The San Diego Sheriff's deputies did the same thing in all of its jurisdictions, in all of its beats. This is a reoccurring theme that's not just present in San Diego, but across the country. This sort of idea of driving while Black is that Blackness alone is sufficient for you to get stopped. We know that Blackness becomes a way of sort of coding threat, oftentimes, particularly in the cases of law enforcement, and not just out when you're driving, but also in schools. The Department of Justice found in its investigation of a the Lauderdale County Youth Courts and police departments, that the departments there were actively being used. The police department was being used in the schools to detain children and use the forces of the criminal justice system to penalize them for school infractions, ultimately funneling them into a criminal justice system that did not respect their constitutional nor civil rights. Similarly, in Ferguson, Missouri, the Department of Justice also found that the ways in which the city and the police department was funding itself was on the backs of fines that were primarily targeted at Black residents in those communities. And so we see over and over again the presumption of Black guilt, and then the use of that to fund the city and to support white spaces. In addition to that, we recognize that this is not just a question of the police enacting this, but a collective recognition that this is possible was made evident in Amy Cooper's now notorious phone call to the police, and in Central Park. Dr. Talley in history makes a really good point to connect what Amy Cooper did in that moment by being told to leash her dog by an African-American man. And in that moment, as he's telling her to leash her dog, she feels slighted by it, calls the police, and says that she's being threatened, that she's concerned for her life. And this way in which she talks about this seems eerily similar. And it's as Dr. Talley points out, it's a point that has been done over the course of history, connected with Black Wall Street, connected with Emmett Till, connected with the wrongful conviction of teenagers in that same Central Park. It is a deep history that results in the presumption of guilt, or is built off the presumption of guilt of Black bodies.
Exactly. And lastly, we have the undermining of Black political voices, which is also something that I know that you, Dr. Gooding, also study and talk about as well in your work.
Absolutely, right? And here we know that interactions with the criminal justice system depresses political participation, right? And it does so in a variety of ways. Not just, it has been sort of well studied and demonstrated that once you are funneled into this sort of the system of mass incarceration, it reduces your ability to engage in a political system, whether it's getting a felony that prevents you from being able to engage while incarcerated, or when you are ultimately back into the community, but even with interactions with police without arrest, that there's studies, and we have demonstrated evidence that shows that engagement with the criminal justice system erodes political efficacy, erodes the idea that you can have an impact on political change. It also erodes political trust, the belief that the institutions of power will be operating and functioning in your interest. And they weaken the capacity of an entire community to engage in politics. And this is where we have to also understand the importance of the long movement for Black lives as activating that, as acknowledging that, and moving folks to recognize their interaction with law enforcement and try to empower them to mobilize and engage to alter those systems.
Exactly. And another discussion that we also want to, of course, have is really the history of African Americans, Black Americans, really challenging and contesting this system of policing. We have a prime example being Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching campaign. And there is so much about lynching that we know now, but that we take for granted, that this information wasn't always accessible. And it took Ida B. Wells to actually do investigations on lynchings, to question the lynchings of Black peoples, which was chronic, which was every day, and to assert through articles and through studies such as A Red Record, which was published in 1895 and beyond, her work Lynch Law, to assert that lynchings were a violation of Black civil rights, that they were not rooted in actual crimes that African Americans had committed, but false ideologies about Black criminality, about Black men raping and assaulting white women, that there was no basis for these acts because the status quo was that these forms of these killings, these extrajudicial killings were necessary, were vital, were important. So Ida B. Wells and many others interject into the discourse a clear challenging of this status quo and of this common practice. And that's vital to recognize as well. It's also important to engage the history of the movement. So something that me and Dr. Gooding talked about in preparing for this was that, in the common discourse around the protests this summer and protests in other recent years has been the assertion that these protests are deficient in some way or ineffective in comparison to those of the past. They've usually been lined up with the movements of the 50s and of the 60s and said to be lesser in comparison. And this is often rooted in misunderstandings of the civil rights movement. The movement entailed undoubtedly nonviolent protest, and this was central, but that wasn't the only method. The Black freedom struggle has never only included one leader. It's never only included one strategy, one organization, and one mode of protest. Coupled with much of what we do see in our history books, the forms of nonviolent protest. In the 50s and 60s, Black folk actually did advocate for self-defense as well and created self-defense organizations. These were just as important as the other entities as well. And it's critical that we acknowledge that in assessing the movement of today. I also want to share that in the midst of discussions about the movement, we really don't hear quotes from our previous, from our civil rights pioneers, such as John Lewis, where he, in the 60s, around 1966, would state, quote, "We're only flesh. I could understand people not wanting to be beaten anymore. The Black capacity to believe that a white person would really open his heart, open his life to nonviolent appeal is running out." We don't hear quotes like that, which allow us to really see that this movement, that the movement of the 50s and 60s was very violent. It was bloody. It was hard and trying and compromised the lives of Black activists, organizers, families, children alike. But it also speaks to a desire for those coming after to not have to deal with having their blood splattered onto the streets, to not having their heads knocked in by law enforcement. That is not the hope of John Lewis's generation at all. And there's a way in which this call for current protesters to presume that the positionality of those in the past is perhaps not intent. The intent is not to portray this message, but it does convey a message that we do want to return to seeing and witnessing what John Lewis and others experienced. And that should not be the goal either. We also notice in these times a de-radicalization of Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and other key figures of the movement. They're weaponized against, again, the current contemporary generation. And that is based on, again, a de-radicalization of these figures. They've also been flattened and simplified. Their politics have also been transformed into colorblind, race-neutral ideals. And that wasn't their positionality at all. Rosa Parks was raised in a Black nationalist household by those who followed Marcus Garvey, a key leader and proponent of Black nationalism, Black-centered spaces, Black leadership by any and all means necessary. We also know that Martin Luther King, towards the end of his life, also became increasingly radicalized. So to weaponize, again, these figures against the contemporary generations is misplaced and doesn't reflect, again, the full visions of those who came before them. There's also a way in which Martin Luther King has been made to be race neutral in ways in which it's often forgotten that he was a freedom fighter, a Black freedom fighter for Black civil rights. And that was what he was fighting for. And that was the goal of his movement. And that's important to not forget either in this discussion as well.
Well said. You know, the ways in which this colorblind framework is deployed in the political and in the public sphere is particularly harmful because what it does is not only does it undermine the work of historical freedom fighters, but it also undermines the charges against the system, right? It suggests that what you have to do is stop focusing on race, and then perhaps it would go away really quickly. And that all we need to do is look past race in order to accomplish a better society and community. And that is deeply problematic, in large part because it chooses to ignore and erase the experiences of people of color. In fact, you know, Davis and Ernst in their article talk about this idea or offer this idea of racial gaslighting, which I think might be useful here, right? So they define racial gaslighting as the political, social, economic, and cultural process that perpetuates and normalizes a white supremacist reality through pathologizing those who resist. And so we can think about gaslighting as this way of sort of convincing someone that you're not sane. What you're saying doesn't make sense. It's not worthy of my my recognition, nor me addressing those concerns. And we see this over and over again in history, from media to the journalists and freedom fighters throughout the course of history have been fighting to talk about specifically about the police, but more broadly, the experience of Black people. And the experience of the police has been, the nature of the police has been to have a different kind of interaction with Black folks in those communities. And only Black people have been trying to communicate what has been happening, oftentimes falling on deaf ears. In fact, the pathologizing has resulted in saying, so what did you do wrong, right? There must have been something that the Black people are doing. And it's not until video, the recent sort of emergence and the deployment of video has been used to show this is something that it's not just new, but it's had a long-standing history. The experience and the realities of Ahmaud Arbery and Walter Scott and individuals who have been killed either by law enforcement or with a recognition by law enforcement and a resistance to actually penalize those who've engaged in those practices. We only know those because video has come to light to demonstrate that these people were lost at the hands of state-sanctioned violence unjustly. So many times these experiences might happen. And in case of Walter Scott, we actually have the report that says something very different. And without the video, there would be no corroboration to say, no, there's something wrong here. Over and over again, in terms of history, we see Black voices being diminished and attempts at police accountability being erased. And it is only this persistent struggle for Black freedom that has been moving to try to lift these voices, lift these experiences, and alter these systems so that they can more adequately address the experience of Black people in the United States.
Yes, and again, these movements early on have long talked about and wanted to challenge and detest police violence. And that's always been a critical part of the movement. And before we transition, we did just want to highlight some texts, they're displayed here, that will allow for a broader understanding of the civil rights movement and allow all of us to really challenge and reverse the ways in which we weaponize those who've come before and against the fullness of their visions, against the fullness of who they were, against those who came after them. We have to be careful with not misusing their memories, not misusing their words in order to weaponize and control the people they fought again and lived for. So that's key to this as well. We also wanted to talk with you all about broadening the movement. It's also key that we offer and align with broader visions of what social justice looks like for Black folk amid state-sanctioned violence. And this includes broadening it for a more gender-inclusive framework. And as displayed here, this is a timeline of various police killings that was put together by the African American Policy Forum, founded by Kimberly Crenshaw, and within that, the Say Her Name campaign. And it highlights the various Black women who've been killed by law enforcement. And you'll see that they have been killed in the same years as very figures and names that we know by Black male victims. What's been clear is in the media and in the rhetoric and discourse about fighting and combating police brutality is that Black women's names are often left outside of the picture and left out of the picture and silenced. Their stories don't compel as much action, as much rigor. And that is something that is also key to really resist and challenge, because in order to fully understand the complexity of police violence, we also have to know that it's also gendered, that it includes very gender-specific mechanisms. And there is no way that we can fully eradicate and challenge this system if we don't know all the ways in which it manifests in Black people's lives. It includes different forms of assault that women uniquely deal with and grapple with. And while we have a clear frame of how police brutality affects Black men, the frame definitely needs to be clear for how it informs the lives of Black women. And the Say Her Name campaign offers a great report on the various contexts in which police killings occur for Black women. And it includes stories of, again, motherhood, context of motherhood in which police killings occur, rape and sexual assault. There are also clear profiles within the report on the experiences of Black trans women who are particularly and uniquely vulnerable to punitive state-sanctioned violence as well. So these stories are critical to the narratives, to our understanding of police violence, and to the solutions. Despite their marginalization, again, they are left out of the picture. And what I find so compelling about this timeline is that it begs the question of what happens if we widen our lens to include and see Black women. Mm-hmm. What happens if we look at Pearlie Golden's murder in 2014? Do we get to August 2014 with the shooting of Michael Brown? Do we get to Tamir Rice? How many more lives do we save if we account for Black women's humanity? And also their assaults on the part of police officers.
Absolutely. One other layer that I think is important to include here is also the experience of Black immigrants, and the ways in which they have to navigate both local police as well as federal authority, and the ways in which they may be operating together or independently to shape the lives of Black immigrants. We know that Black immigrants are disproportionately sort of funneled through the what immigration activists call the prison to deportation pipeline. In my discussion with Black immigrants, in this current political moment, the feeling that for those who are, and I want to be clear here, naturalized citizens question whether in this moment, whether their citizenship is vulnerable to being removed from them in light of aggressive attacks on their Blackness and their immigrant status. And so we should be mindful as well about the ways in which these layers of the multiple ways in which we exist can shape our vulnerability to different systems and state power. And I know that we want to sort of take questions, answers, but I think we should just before we transition, highlight some of the things that we've seen over the course in terms of implications for the future over the past few weeks. We've seen radical changes in terms of the removal of monuments across the country. And I think that we need to be clear about what these monuments are doing, what this removal it represents. These monuments, they're, in terms of, so we can talk about Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, the Confederate flag emblem being removed from Mississippi state flag, to various Confederate monuments across the country. And what we know is that, yes, this has been an accomplishment, right? This has been possible through this movement, but it is not exclusively a moment of celebration, because it speaks to the fact that these monuments that were erected to white supremacy, and oftentimes erected specifically to intimidate Black people, right? Schools named after Confederate generals in the wake of the integration and Brown v. Board of Education, right? These are specifics, these were monuments to white supremacy, and their coming down is a reminder of that commitment to white supremacy that the nation has demonstrated, not only in the past, but also that it took until 2020 for us to come to terms with it. But I'll turn it over to you, Channon, on that.
Yes, and to conclude, because we do want to be sure to get to Q&A, Aunt Jemima, we have her placed here because she is an example of a monument in many ways, although she is not in parks or really cemented on public landscapes in the ways that these other monuments are. Aunt Jemima was created based upon a minstrel character, based upon a typification of a mammy figure. And the branding of Aunt Jemima was led by a desire to return to white supremacist South, a desire to return to mammy figures in white households that were subservient in all forms and capacities to their white families, and happily did so, and happily lived within a color line based society, and was not a proponent of protesting this or interrogating this color line. So to see the removal of Aunt Jemima, or the changes in that brand, is also a monumental change as well.
So we obviously could go on, but we really want to hear your voices and your questions and respond accordingly.
Hello. Can you, these are the words I hate these days. Can you hear me now? So, I think you can see me as well. You personally, I think this was just brilliant. I enjoyed you very much. I think I'm supposed to be on video. Okay, there we go. Hello. I have several questions that have come in from the audience, and also some submitted questions. And what I'm noticing is that they're similar. So you may not hear your exact question, but I'm synthesizing the two. But just before I start with the really complex questions, there's somebody named John who wanted Channon to clarify one of her points. So we'll just start there. And it was, John asks, could Channon please repeat her point regarding John Lewis et al. Versus more recent protesting modalities? I didn't understand what she
It cut off there, so I didn't get to hear the last bit of the question.
I'm sorry. John asked, could Channon please repeat her point regarding John Lewis et al. Versus recent protesting modalities? I didn't understand. I'm going to stop my video. Yeah, did you get all that? I think it's my internet.
Yes, I got it in and out for sure, but I think I got the question. Yes, I included that quote from John Lewis where he speaks to how exhausted and tired he is of the forms of protest they've been embarking on, which have led to the loss of their lives, loss of their limbs, loss of their blood, and speaking to how he can understand why it is time for a change and time for a transition in the ways in which they protest, what we saw in the ways in which they were protesting. Because what we saw in the late 1960s was a shift and a desire to move beyond and move past the ways in which they had been protesting in the streets prior, which had allowed for the furthering of their brutalization. There was a desire among especially young Black people at this time to no longer lose their parents, lose their siblings to the types of mass assaults that were happening in the streets on the part of law enforcement. And so his quote, I find that to be valuable because it really speaks that level of exhaustion, but also a desire for change and a desire for something different for even those to come after them, and a recognition that there are multiple ways that within which to achieve what we'd like to achieve, and let's explore that. I can see why we're exploring that. I can see why we're desiring of that at this time. How much more blood should we sacrifice? I don't think we should sacrifice any more blood. That's the expression coming from John Lewis in that quote. And it's a quote that's, again, among many others, not often circulated or discussed, because that's a part of the movement and a sentiment within the movement that has really been suppressed within our recollections of this history. Our recollections have really erased how violent the civil rights movement actually was, how again, I use the term bloody, it was for all those involved. I also want to recognize that this is happening even in the throes of not only police brutality in the streets, but of bombings of Black churches and Black homes. I want to acknowledge the 4 little girls of Birmingham, Alabama, who in the midst of peaceful protest, their church was bombed, 16th Street Baptist Church, and 4 little girls lost their lives. So there's a great level of fatigue and a desire for change and a recognition that there are multiple visions and pathways towards freedom that are worth considering and using.
Thank you, Channon. I'm here. I'm just keeping my video off. There's some wonderful questions coming in. Here's one from Dr. Evelyn Kirkley. She's the director of our Women and Gender Studies and Sexuality program. And she asks both Dr. Gooding and Dr. Miller, and we'll start with Dr. Gooding, this particular question. Resmaa Menakem's concept of radicalized trauma makes a lot of sense. Could you comment on that? What do you think? Dr. Gooding needs his...
Yep, there we go. In terms of radicalized trauma, I would actually appreciate a little bit more sort of how that is sort of being understood, because I have 2 ways of sort of conceptualizing that in terms of how the trauma affects, to sort of highlight Channon's sort of comments about John Lewis, right? That how the trauma is enduring, the trauma is long lasting, and the trauma it can be passed down in ways that we need to think about the harm that is being done, right? That is generational. At the same time, the sort of radicalization of it, and again, I'm not familiar with sort of how the author is sort of conceptualizing that radicalization, I think is important in this moment. And in particular, one of the things that we oftentimes spend a lot of time dismissing is certain kinds of emotions in our politics in the current moment. We dismiss anger as not necessarily worthy of recognition. We dismiss what folks would call rage as not worthy of having a space at the political table. And in fact, it is a righteous anger that is necessary. It is what has called people to leave their homes amidst a pandemic, right? To protest on behalf of the lives of folks who have been, the lives that have been taken away, right? And the lives that have been irreparably harmed by state-sanctioned violence. We cannot dismiss that kind of righteous anger. We cannot dismiss the kind of work that it does to push the system and push the society out of complacency and comfort so that it can achieve a better version of itself. So I'll stop there. Hopefully.
Did you want to address that question as well?
Yes, I just want to echo with what Cory mentioned is the validity of Black rage and how the movement in the past, in the present would not be able to thrive without that in the various ways in which it is expressed.
Okay. We are getting a lot of, I think we've got about 12 minutes left, and we're getting a lot of questions about USD. I am going to, just to tell everyone, I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to ask at least one more question that comes from the audience before that. This is from Shannon. She says that she's curious to hear more thoughts on the role of private property, particularly in cases including Latasha Harlan's, Trayvon Martin, and Ahmaud Arbery in violence against Black bodies. The response of protesting and rioting and the familiar narrative that quickly separates and celebrates peaceful protest while demonizing rioting and looting as counterproductive. Anybody want to take that one on? Or I can.
Was she, and so the question is wanting us to speak more on
the role of private property in the cases, including the three names that I just gave you, the violence against Black bodies.
Yes.
And separation between using the terms protesting and rioting and celebrating peaceful protest while demonizing rioting.
Right. Yeah. So many Black lives are lost as a result of, again, this idea of wanting to protect. We mentioned earlier this theme of protecting white spaces, and it's often in those contexts, especially with Latasha Harlan's, or that case is especially distinct in the makeup there. But there's a way in which in spaces within private properties and more that has led to the assault of Black lives. That's worth acknowledging. And I also want to share that looting and rioting have, again, a movement has never just had one method of protest. It's never been singular. And even within the movement, to be clear, there's always been even disagreements about, okay, what actually works best? What's always effective? What is most effective? But I do want to acknowledge that there are multiple forms of protest that have always been used. And that includes forms of uprisings, or what's also referred to as riotings in the media. That's also included forms of looting as a form of protesting private properties that do not serve Black communities and the people within them. I always reference, in again, my courses, a prime example when we talk about private property and how disrupting private property has been a form of Black protest. We talk about the slave period or the period of enslavement, and when the enslaved ran away, or especially during Harriet Tubman's days, during her rescue missions, such as over the Combahee River in South Carolina, that before they left, they actually would burn mills down, the houses of slaveholders down. Black women also would sometimes take a couple of dresses and necklaces and pearls. They probably couldn't keep them for long on their journey, but there was a way in which that was their way of saying this system of this private property has been used and grown in a way that's been based on the exploitation of our labor, and our form of resistance is running away, but also disrupting and destroying this property as well. Again, there's just always been multiple methods, and the demonization of Black rage in general is tied to misunderstandings of the past civil rights movements, and again, uncomfortable. I think there's a level of discomfort with Black folks pursuing citizenship by all and any means necessary. There's a level of discomfort there because it is against the status quo for sure, and especially against the order that has long been in place in this American society, as we discussed earlier in the presentation as well.
Cory, did you want to address that?
Sure, just a quick point to say that, you know, this idea, and just to add on there, this idea of property and private property and race have been so intermingled over the course of American history, in large part because the beginnings of the nation sort of defined people as property. And as we sort of think about the current moment, the defense of spaces, I think about Ahmaud Arbery and the sort of reference to Trayvon Martin as not just the home as defining what is owned, but spaces even more broadly as being defined as not open to Black people, and the presumption of threat and guilt that we discussed earlier results in a sense of a sense that one can defend property even beyond the personal, right? Even beyond the personal, and sometimes to the detriment of another life, right? That we are willing to sacrifice life for property is a tension that seems to manifest itself over and over again, and one that we need to reckon with. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Gooding. That was great. We are getting closer to the end, so I am going to jump into the USD questions. There are two questions that kind of tie together. One was submitted and one is in the chat. The first is, what is the role of higher education in the movement for Black lives? And then to follow up on that, what do you think are the biggest initiatives that USD needs to focus on when it comes to supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and empowering experiences? And that's from Linnea in the audience. You can start with either of you, if you choose to tackle it.
So there's multiple sort of questions there about USD and higher education more broadly. Mm-hmm. Certainly, higher education has a role to play, not only in sort of challenging the sort of status quo and challenging itself in this moment, but also recognizing that it has a responsibility to sort of alter these systems. If, as I highlighted before, institutions of higher education, primary, secondary, and higher education have been integrated with an investment in white supremacy. So as I highlighted before, right, like if institutions were named after Confederate generals, you can do that with a specific name to say some people are not welcome here. And you can do that in other ways that are not necessarily as overt. And that institutions of higher education across the board need to think about the ways in which it is making some members of the community welcome versus others. It also needs to think about how it can challenge the people who it is charged with educating, right? And challenge them to think about how race shapes their lives and shapes their experience in the United States. So I think there's a variety of ways, both one, dependent upon self-reflection for institutions of higher education, and we've seen a lot of moves over the past few weeks in that regard, but also in terms of its charge and its responsibility for the people who it is charged to educate.
Yes, I definitely echo that. I think Cory covered that quite well.
Okay. Any ideas specifically for USD?
Oh, yes. Ideas specifically for USD. I mean, in the case of USD and so many other universities, it's critical to value and center and uphold and elevate the voices and experiences of Black students. That's key to make sure that they have the resources that they need, but also Black faculty and Black administrators as well, Black staff and beyond. There are also critical and valuable roles that they play within the university that are so important to uphold and protect, and really, again, continuously evolve in that role or in that manner.
Okay. Actually, those were the main questions about USD. I'm being told that I should ask you one more question. There are two questions that go beyond USD, which is something right now the college and the university is tackling the questions about the Black Lives Movement and our Black faculty with sincerity and gusto. So we're jumping right in, and I want everybody to stay tuned for what we're going to do to address that. But in the meantime, there are people that are not from USD who are asking questions. One is from Oregon. There's a woman named Jessica from Oregon, and she's a young a woman who is trying to get her community and an ad hoc committee to start using the words Black Lives Matter in a proclamation. And she's having difficulty doing that. So you've got somebody out there asking, what can she do to do that? And then one of the submitted questions comes from a senior. They call themselves a senior. What did they do to get seniors to start using those words? And what do they do as advantaged white seniors to take some action in this movement? So you've got people from all over asking what they can do. Any last comments on that one? And
Well,
you should see the questions, Dr. Gooding, Dr. Miller. I mean, there is absolutely no way. People are so taken with what you're doing here. It's just brilliant. So,
I can speak to what they can contribute to, and I'd love to have, and I'm sure Cory has so many thoughts as well, especially on how to, bring Black Lives Matter into the language of these various groups. But regarding support, there are, again, various, within your towns, first and foremost, there are various Black organizations or communities and Black and brown spaces in your communities. I think it's important to turn inward and build relationships with those folks and support them, support their efforts, provide financial funding, because a lot of these organizations, especially on the local level, do not have the financial support that they need either. So figuring out how to partner with these organizations and starting at home is really is key. Across cities, we also have Black children who are in their schools that are underfunded and more and in need of advocacy and those who can vote and more on their behalf, but also be active, again, participants in many ways. So starting locally is really important, but there also are various national organizations that we will be sending out to you all. We've sent to the organizer of this program to send out in an email, but we've listed here the Say Her Name campaign, mapping police violence, and beyond. Those are key national entities that are vital to, that have on their platforms ways to contribute, but also ways to best understand what they are doing. And they also have educational materials on these platforms that can be distributed to the people who you're trying to educate on this language and movement.
To add to that, we have included some extraordinary resources. The history department has put together an excellent resource list as well to help folks think about this. There is a work that needs to be done. I appreciate the desire for conversations in community to challenge one another and to help communities sort of evolve on this issue. And I think those discussions are necessary. They can be really challenging, but they also have to come from a place of information, right? It is hard to speak sort of abstractly and anecdotally. So it's really helpful and useful to use the resources that scholars like Dr. Miller and myself and others have been putting together to help to navigate these conversations and to inform these conversations, so they're not made out of a place of just not knowing and deeply understanding. And in terms of activity, one of the things that we have to be mindful of, that I'm, political scientist, so I'll say it, as you go to, engage with elected officials and engage with organizations that are moving elected officials, it is one thing to talk about presidential elections. Those are important, yes, but there's so much work that happens at the state and the local level that has a profound impact on the day-to-day lives of those communities, and to challenge and to listen and to move according to your conscience about how the institutions at the state level and the local level can improve and can advance and can reconceptualize the ways in which it engages in public safety and engages in the practice of community building, and support and defense is really important. I'll stop there. I know we're over time.
And hi, I'm gonna do my closing comments with my video on. We'll see if this works. I think that was a perfect way to end this. Thank you so much. And I think you have a last slide that puts up for everybody, is that true, some of the details that you just stated? If not, I know that just as you said, it's gonna come in the email. So yeah. We have run out of time. This has been recorded, so we're gonna make sure that Dr. Gooding and Dr. Miller see all of your questions. But we wanna thank them very much for their time. For shedding as much light as they can in 1 hour on this really critical conversation. And we thank the audience for joining us. So we will email all of you who are here those resources that are related to this topic, the formal topic, the movement for Black lives and the Black freedom struggle. And you should receive that email tomorrow. I want to tell you, we have another one of these conversations next week, and it will be with a sociology professor, Dr. Sid Martinez, and with some of his community partners, and they will be talking about what defunding the police means. And I think you need to sign up right away for that. We're sending out notifications. You'll be getting, because I know that this one in particular actually filled up. So anyway, thank you. Thank you.